At 4:07 a.m., my hands were wrapped around a bundle of thorned roses when my mother decided I was no longer part of the future. "We're signing the flower shop over to your sister." She didn't even look at me. The prep room smelled like eucalyptus and cold metal. The cooler hummed behind me. I had already been there for 2 hours, processing wedding inventory, confirming a funeral delivery, answering a vendor text from San Diego. Camille was still asleep. "She has a marketing degree," my father said calmly. "We need someone who understands expansion." I rebuilt our margins when we were down 27%. I negotiated supplier contracts. I signed the personal guarantee on our lease when their credit wasn't strong enough, but apparently I was good with flowers. Camille tilted her head and smiled. "You'll still work here. Just not as the owner." Not as the owner. After 15 years of 4 a.m. mornings. I didn't raise my voice. I untied my apron, folded it neatly on the counter, walked to my locker, and took out a small, sealed envelope. I placed it in her hand. "Before you file anything," I said, quietly, "read that. If this story hits somewhere uncomfortable for you, go ahead and like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel that connection. I don't want sympathy clicks. And tell me something in the comments. What state are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I'm in Oregon, and it was barely past 4 in the morning when my family decided to replace me. Because what happened after she opened that envelope didn't just change our business. It changed the balance of power in that room. I grew up inside that shop. Not metaphorically. Literally. I learned how to count change on the old brass register before I learned long division in school. Rowan Petals opened in Bend 18 years ago when I was 11, but my parents liked to tell people it was a family dream. The truth is, it became my responsibility long before it became my choice. By 14, I was waking up at 4 a.m. on Saturdays to help process shipments. The delivery truck from California would arrive before sunrise, boxes damp with condensation stamped with airport codes from San Diego and Los Angeles. I learned how to slice open cardboard without bruising petals, how to check for botrytis on roses, how to rehydrate hydrangeas so they didn't collapse by noon. My friends had summer jobs at smoothie bars. I had frostbite from standing inside a floral cooler that never quite reached the temperature printed on its dial. When customers walked in, they usually asked for my mother. "Is Denise here?" they'd say, even when I was the one who had designed their daughter's wedding arch. I would smile and say she'd be out in a moment. I learned early that visibility and authority are not the same thing. You can carry the weight and still not own the name on the sign. Camille. My younger sister was 5 years behind me in everything except approval. She was brighter in photographs, more polished in conversation. When she left for the University of Oregon to study marketing, my mother cried at the airport like she was sending off the future. When I told them I was considering finishing my associate degree in business administration, my father asked who would open the store if I was in class. In 2016, when Ben's retail market tightened and we lost 2 large wedding contracts to a bigger florist in Portland, revenue dropped 27% in a single quarter. I remember sitting at the small metal desk in the back office, the one that still smells faintly like printer toner and coffee grounds, staring at the profit and loss statement. My father kept saying, "It'll rebound." My mother said, "We just need better branding." I stayed late every night that summer renegotiating supplier contracts. I called our primary wholesaler in San Diego and pushed for volume discounts. I consolidated deliveries to cut freight costs. I built an inventory spreadsheet that tracked shrinkage rates by flower type because no one else had ever measured it. By December, margins were up 18%. No one announced that number at Christmas dinner. Around that same time, our original 5-year lease was expiring. The building we occupy sits 2 blocks from Drake Park, in a strip of low brick storefronts that look charming in photos and expensive in reality. Our landlord, Marjorie Whitcomb, is in her 70s. Her late husband had been a florist. She cares about stability more than she cares about glossy signage. When we sat down to renew the lease, she asked for updated financials and a personal guarantor. My parents' credit had taken hits from a late payroll tax filing during the slump. The bank had flagged it. Marjorie noticed. "I need someone I trust on the hook," she said calmly, tapping the lease with one manicured finger. I was 21. I had a clean credit report and a track record of actually being in the store at dawn. So I signed as the personal guarantor on a 10-year commercial lease at $3,200 a month. I remember the weight of the pen, the smell of Marjorie's lavender hand cream, the way my father said, "It's just paperwork." It wasn't just paperwork. It meant that if Rowan Petals defaulted, I was personally liable. It meant the landlord believed I was the operational backbone. It meant I had leverage I didn't fully understand yet. There was a clause buried in Section 14.3, change of control. If more than 50% of ownership transferred without the written consent of the guarantor and landlord, the lease could be declared in default. At the time, I highlighted it because I was the one reading the contract line by line. My parents skimmed. Over the next decade, I became the point of contact for nearly everything. Vendors called me directly. Brides texted me photos of peonies at midnight asking if they would be in season. Funeral homes requested me by name. About 70% of our recurring accounts were tied to relationships I had built personally. Camille would come home on holidays and stage photos in front of the cooler, captioning them third-generation legacy, even though we were barely second-generation. My mother started saying things like, "We need to modernize." My father began talking about expansion, second location, e-commerce fulfillment, subscription bouquets. Camille graduated with her marketing degree and worked at a tech startup in Portland for 2 years. When that job ended, she moved back to Bend to help scale the brand. Help. Within weeks, she redesigned our logo. She suggested cheaper filler flowers to increase margins. She talked about influencer partnerships and paid ads. I listened. I adjusted where it made sense. But I also noticed something else. Neither of my parents ever mentioned ownership when they spoke to her. They said, "When this is yours," casually, like it had already been decided in a room I was not invited into. I kept opening the store at 4 a.m. I kept closing at 6 p.m. I kept signing vendor invoices and balancing payroll. I kept paying attention. 3 weeks before the morning they handed her the business, my father asked me for a digital copy of the lease. He said Gregory, our attorney, wanted to review structure. My stomach tightened in a way I couldn't explain. That afternoon after closing, I walked 2 blocks to Marjorie's office. She poured tea into thin porcelain cups and listened while I explained that there might be changes to ownership. "Are you still the guarantor?" she asked. "Yes." "Then you should reread Section 14. I did. Slowly. That was the first moment I realized that while I didn't own Rowan Petals on paper, I was woven into it legally in ways no one else had bothered to track. So when my mother said, "We're signing the flower shop over to your sister," it wasn't just betrayal I felt. It was recognition. They thought I was replaceable because I worked quietly. They thought visibility was the same as value. They thought I would keep absorbing risk without asking for title. They forgot whose name was on the line that kept the doors open. And I didn't remind them. Not yet. The meeting with Gregory Hale was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, right in the middle of wedding season. My mother chose that time deliberately. She said it would be efficient. I had already been up since 4, processed 3 large arrangements, and fielded 2 calls from a funeral director who needed a rush order by the afternoon. By the time I drove to Gregory's office, my hands still smelled faintly of crushed stems and floral preservative. His office sits above a coffee shop downtown, the kind with exposed brick and framed degrees lining the hallway. When I walked in, the paperwork was already stacked neatly at the center of the conference table. Camille was seated beside my mother, posture straight, wearing a cream blazer that looked more corporate than anything that had ever existed inside our shop. My father nodded at me like this was routine. Gregory adjusted his glasses and began explaining the amendment to our operating agreement. He used calm, neutral language. This document reallocates membership interest, he said. 80% to Camille Rowan, effective immediately upon filing with the Oregon Secretary of State. 20% retained collectively by Harold and Denise Rowan. My name was not mentioned. I waited for it. Some acknowledgement, some percentage, even 5% as a courtesy. It didn't come. Camille leaned forward slightly. It just makes sense, she said. We need clear leadership if we're going to scale. Investors and partners take us more seriously when the structure reflects modern strategy. Investors? We had never taken outside capital. My father folded his hands. You'll still be head floral designer, he told me. Operations. That's your strength. Operations. Like I was being assigned a shift not erased from equity. Gregory slid a separate document across the table. There's also a revised compensation structure, he added. Salary adjustment to reflect managerial reporting lines. Reporting lines. Meaning I would report to my younger sister inside the business I had effectively run for a decade. My mother finally looked at me then. This isn't personal, Eliza. Camille understands branding digital growth partnerships. You prefer to stay behind the scenes. That's not ownership energy. Ownership energy. The phrase landed heavier than it should have. I thought about the mornings I stood alone in the cooler while condensation gathered on the ceiling. I thought about signing the lease as a guarantor when none of them qualified. I thought about the spreadsheets I built to stop the bleeding during the downturn. Camille reached across the table and touched my wrist lightly, almost theatrically. You're irreplaceable creatively, she said. But businesses need vision. Irreplaceable, just not indispensable. Gregory cleared his throat. For clarity, once filed, this amendment will constitute a change of controlling interest. Camille will hold decision-making authority. Change of controlling interest. The words echoed in my head with more weight than anyone in that room seemed to register. My father signed first. His pen scratched loudly against the paper. My mother followed. Camille's signature was confident, practiced. Gregory looked at me not unkindly. You're not required to sign this amendment, he said carefully. You are not currently a listed member. Not currently. The room felt smaller. The hum of the HVAC system overhead sounded almost mechanical, like the cooler back at the shop. Everything felt procedural, efficient, clean. I nodded once. I understand, I said. There was a brief pause, as if they expected something louder. Anger, tears, negotiation. Instead, I stood up, smoothing the front of my blouse. I need to get back to the store, I added. We have a noon pickup. On the drive back, my hands gripped the steering wheel harder than necessary. Ben's late morning light looked deceptively calm. People walked their dogs along the river. Nothing about the town suggested that in a small upstairs office, I had just been written out of ownership of the business I had kept alive. When I stepped into Rowan Petals, the scent of lilies hit me immediately. The cooler door was slightly ajar. A delivery invoice sat on the counter waiting for my signature. Camille arrived 20 minutes later, energized. We're going to rebrand the subscription model first, she announced, setting her laptop down like she was claiming territory. And I'll need you to train Megan on vendor communications. We'll centralize approvals through me starting next week. Through her. I listened. I watched my mother nod approvingly from behind the register. My father stayed near the back office, already discussing growth projections on his phone. They moved around the shop like I was already an employee. That was when I walked to my locker. The envelope was where I had left it, tucked behind an old invoice binder. Inside were copies of the lease section 14 highlighted in yellow, and a letter from Marjorie confirming the enforceability of the change of control clause. I closed the locker door slowly and turned back toward the front of the shop. Camille was laughing about influencer partnerships. I untied my apron, and this time I didn't fold it carefully. I walked toward her with the envelope in my hand. I didn't hand Camille the envelope immediately. For a moment, I just stood there feeling the texture of the paper under my fingers. It was standard white, nothing dramatic. No bold lettering. No threat printed across the front. Just weight. The kind that comes from knowing something the room doesn't. Camille was mid-sentence explaining how we could optimize seasonal margins by shifting toward more cost-effective filler flowers and running targeted ads within a 50-mile radius. My mother watched her the way she used to watch cooking shows, leaning forward slightly, absorbing every word like it was instruction. I walked past them to the design table and set the envelope down carefully between a bucket of ranunculus and the invoice clipboard. Before you submit the amendment, I said evenly, you should read this. Camille glanced at it, amused, more than concerned. What is it? Just something relevant, I replied. My father looked irritated. We've already gone through this with Gregory. I know, I said. This isn't about the operating agreement. That got his attention. Camille picked up the envelope, slid her finger under the seal, and unfolded the documents. The sound of paper opening felt louder than it should have. My mother crossed her arms. At first, Camille scanned it casually, then slower. Her brow shifted. What is this? She asked. The commercial lease, I answered. Section 14. Change of control. My father stepped closer. We renewed that years ago. Yes, I said. We did. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush. I explained it the same way I explained to brides why peonies wilt in direct sun. When we signed the 10-year renewal 12 years ago, Marjorie required a personal guarantor. You remember that. My mother's jaw tightened. Yes, and I signed it. Camille looked up. Okay, and, Section 14.3 states that if more than 50% of ownership transfers without written consent from the guarantor and landlord, the lease may be declared in default. There was a brief silence, but not yet the kind that shifts power, just confusion. My father took the document from Camille's hand. He read more carefully. His lips moved slightly over the clause. He had always skimmed contracts. I never did. That's a technicality, he said after a moment. It's enforceable, I replied. Gregory will confirm that. My mother shook her head. Marjorie would never terminate our lease over something like that. I held her gaze. She doesn't rent to paperwork. She rents to people she trusts. They didn't know I had met with Marjorie 3 weeks earlier. They didn't know I had sat in her small office while she poured chamomile tea and asked me directly whether ownership was changing. If it does, she had said quietly, I need to be notified. And I will decide whether the lease continues. Back in the shop, Camille's confidence began to thin. So what are you saying, she asked. That you'll block the transfer, I'm saying. I answered carefully that if ownership changes by 80%, and I'm still the personal guarantor, the lease can be declared in default. And if the lease is terminated, we have 30 days to vacate. My father's face lost color in increments. Relocation would be expensive, he muttered almost to himself. Current rent is $3,200 a month, I said. Market rate on this block is closer to $5,100. Moving costs build out deposits. We'd be looking at roughly $160,000 to $180,000. Minimum. The cooler clicked on behind us again. A low mechanical hum filled the silence. Camille looked from me to my father. That can't be right. It is, I said. I reached for the final sheet in the packet. A short letter on cream stationery. This is from Marjorie, confirming that the change of control clause remains valid under Oregon commercial lease law, and that written consent from both landlord and guarantor is required for ownership transfers exceeding 50%. My mother stared at me as if I had grown unfamiliar. Why didn't you mention this before? Because no one asked, I replied. That wasn't entirely true. I hadn't mentioned it because I believed for years that loyalty would eventually be recognized, that if I worked hard enough, ownership would follow naturally. I never anticipated needing leverage. Camille folded the papers slowly. So this is blackmail. The word landed sharp. No, I said evenly. It's a contract. She exhaled, frustrated. You would jeopardize the business over ego. I looked around the shop, the glass display case, the handwritten thank you notes taped near the register, the faint water stains on the ceiling tiles from an old leak I had personally coordinated repairs for. I'm not jeopardizing anything, I said. You changed the controlling interest without addressing the lease structure. That creates risk. My father rubbed his temples. Gregory should have flagged this. He may have, I answered. Did you ask him about the lease silence again? My mother's voice softened, but not with warmth. What do you want, Eliza? That question felt heavier than the documents in Camille's hand. I could have said I wanted them to reverse everything out of fear. I could have walked out and let the lease default. I could have watched relocation costs swallow the margins I had spent years rebuilding. Instead, I said, I want acknowledgement of what I actually am to this business. Camille's jaw tightened, which is, not an employee. The words hung in the air. I don't want 80%, I continued. I don't want to control you. But I will not personally guarantee the lease for a business I don't legally own. My father looked up sharply. Are you saying you'd withdraw as guarantor? If ownership changes without my consent? I said calmly, yes. I would notify Marjorie that I'm no longer willing to carry that liability. The realization settled slowly across all three of their faces. For the first time since that 4:07 a.m. announcement, no one was talking about marketing strategy. They were calculating risk. Camille sank into one of the metal chairs near the design table. So what now? Now. I had thought about that question for weeks, though I never believed I would need to answer it. Now, I said quietly, we have a conversation that should have happened before any paperwork was drafted. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry anymore either. What I felt was something steadier. For 15 years, I had been the quiet infrastructure, the one who absorbed pressure without asking for title. They mistook silence for weakness. What I handed Camille wasn't revenge, it was gravity. And the room finally felt it. Before I tell you what my father said next, I want to pause here for a second. If you were in my position holding a clause that could legally shut down your own family's business in 30 days, would you use it to walk away? Or to force them to see you? Don't answer lightly. Put it in the comments. And if this kind of quiet power shift is something you understand, deeply subscribe, but only if you're here for real stories about boundaries, not drama. Because what happened after that silence wasn't loud. It was decisive. The silence didn't last long. My father was the first to move. He picked up his phone and stepped into the back office, closing the glass-paneled door behind him. I could see his reflection faintly in the window as he dialed Gregory. My mother remained standing near the counter, arms folded tightly like she was bracing against a draft that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. Camille sat still, the lease papers resting in her lap, her earlier confidence replaced with calculation. I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. That was different. Through the glass, I could see my father pacing. His shoulders were tighter than usual. He spoke quietly at first, then more firmly. I couldn't hear Gregory's side of the conversation, but I could read my father's face when he reached section 14. He stopped pacing. He listened. He turned slightly away from us. When he came back out, he didn't look at Camille first. He looked at me. Gregory says the clause is valid, he said evenly. It qualifies as a change of controlling interest. My mother's jaw set. That's absurd. We're not selling the company. It's still family. It doesn't matter, I replied quietly. The lease defines control by percentage ownership. 80% qualifies. Camille stood up abruptly. So what, you're going to call Marjorie and threaten to shut us down? I already spoke with her, I said. That landed harder than anything else had. When my mother asked, 3 weeks ago. My father stared at me, not angry, just surprised. You anticipated this. I noticed you asked for the lease, I said. And I know you don't reread contracts unless something's changing. The cooler motor kicked on again, humming through the tension. A customer walked in, briefly glanced around at the atmosphere, and quietly walked back out. The bell above the door barely made a sound. My father ran a hand through his hair. Gregory said if the guarantor withdraws, the landlord can issue a notice to cure or terminate within 30 days. Yes, I said. That's standard under Oregon commercial lease enforcement. Camille's voice sharpened. This is unbelievable. You're leveraging a technicality to grab control. I'm protecting myself from liability, I corrected. That distinction mattered. For 12 years, my name had been tied to the risk of this storefront. If the business failed, I was exposed. If they defaulted, I was exposed. Yet ownership had never been formalized in my favor. You signed that lease because you wanted to help, my mother said. I signed it because you couldn't, I replied. The words were calm, but they didn't need volume to land. Another silence. This one heavier. My father pulled out a chair and sat down at the design table. Not at the head. Just down. His posture had shifted from authority to assessment. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. There it was. Not dismissal, not command. A question. I didn't rush to answer. I walked to the counter, adjusted a vase that had begun to tilt, and returned. I wanted them to feel the time it took me to respond. For once, I'm not interested in 80%, I said finally. And I'm not interested in sabotaging the shop. I want structural alignment. Camille let out a small, incredulous laugh. Structural alignment? Yes. I placed my hands flat on the metal table, the same one I'd worked at since high school. I want formal ownership reflecting operational reality, equal voting interest between you and me, defined managerial roles, and written acknowledgement that I remain guarantor only if my equity position reflects my risk. My mother stared. You're negotiating. I'm correcting, I said. Camille shook her head. You could have just said you felt overlooked. I did, I replied, for 15 years. Quietly. That was the first moment her expression flickered, not anger, but something closer to realization. She had always seen the visible side of the shop, the weddings, the Instagram moments, the aesthetic. She hadn't been there at 4 a.m. when the heaters failed in winter. She hadn't dealt with refund disputes or vendor shortages during peak season. My father leaned back in his chair. Gregory says if we want to avoid triggering the clause, the amendment would need written consent from both landlord and guarantor before filing. Otherwise, we'd have to restructure below the 50% threshold. Camille crossed her arms. So what, 49% to me? That would avoid default technically, my father said slowly. But it wouldn't address liability, I added. If I remain sole guarantor while control shifts informally, that's still exposure. My mother's voice softened, though not entirely in surrender. We thought you didn't care about ownership. I cared about the business surviving, I said. Ownership was implied. Until today. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a pale glow. Nothing cinematic. Nothing dramatic. Just paperwork and breath and the faint scent of lilies. Camille looked at the lease again. If we involve Marjorie formally, she said she'll know we didn't review this properly. She already knows, I answered. That truth settled in. Power didn't shift because I yelled. It shifted because the math didn't favor them anymore. My father exhaled slowly. We need Gregory here. I agree, I said. Not because I needed validation, but because I wanted everything documented. This wasn't a family argument anymore, it was governance. And for the first time in 15 years, they weren't speaking about the shop as if I were background labor. They were speaking to me as a stakeholder. Not out of affection, out of necessity. And that was enough. Gregory arrived 40 minutes later, still carrying his leather briefcase and the same controlled expression he wore in every meeting. He didn't look surprised to see tension in the room. He looked like a man who had already anticipated it. We gathered around the design table again, 4 chairs pulled close, papers spread out between us like something fragile that might break if handled carelessly. The shop was technically open, but my mother had flipped the sign to buy appointment only to avoid interruptions. The front windows let in soft afternoon light, and for a moment the place looked peaceful. It almost felt dishonest. Gregory adjusted his glasses and reviewed the lease copy I had provided. "Yes," he said calmly. "Section 14.3 is enforceable. A transfer of 80% membership interest constitutes a change of control. Under Oregon commercial lease standards, the landlord may declare default unless written consent is obtained from both the landlord and the personal guarantor." He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. Camille shifted in her chair. "Can't we just get consent retroactively?" Gregory paused. "Possibly. But that requires the guarantor's agreement. And the landlord's. Both have leverage." He looked at me briefly when he said that word. Leverage. My father folded his hands. "If Eliza withdraws as guarantor," Gregory nodded slightly, "the landlord could issue a notice to cure. If unresolved termination within 30 days is legally defensible." My mother's voice was tight. "So we're being cornered over paperwork." "No," Gregory replied gently. "You're being reminded that paperwork defines authority." Silence settled again, but this one was different from earlier. It wasn't confusion. It was recalibration. Camille looked at me directly. "What else?" she asked. It wasn't hostile. It was cautious. I didn't rush. I reached into my bag and pulled out another folder, thinner but more personal. "I didn't want this to be about fear," I said. "So let's talk about substance." Inside the folder were vendor agreements, 3 of our largest suppliers. While the LLC was listed as the purchasing entity, I was the operational contact on all primary accounts. Over the years, I had negotiated preferential pricing tied to volume consistency and relationship continuity. If I leave, I said evenly, these pricing tiers reset. Not immediately, but at renewal. Camille frowned. "They wouldn't just drop us. They wouldn't drop the business," I clarified. "They would reevaluate terms." Gregory nodded subtly. "Supplier relationships can materially affect margin structure." I continued. 72% of our recurring wedding accounts were referred through direct planner relationships I manage. If I'm no longer positioned as lead designer or operational authority, that impacts client retention. Camille's expression shifted again. Not defensive, not dismissive, measured. "This isn't about shutting the doors," I said. "It's about accurately defining who keeps them open." My father leaned forward. "Spell it out." So I did. "I want 40% membership interest allocated to me formally, 40% to Camille. The remaining 20% retained by you and Mom collectively. I want the operating agreement amended to name me managing member for operational authority. Camille can lead branding and expansion initiatives under defined scope." Camille inhaled slowly. "Equal stake?" "Yes. And if we say no," I didn't hesitate. "I withdraw as personal guarantor. I notify Marjorie formally of the control transfer. She evaluates her position, and I prepare to step away." The word "away" hung in the air, heavier than any threat, because stepping away meant more than losing a lease. It meant losing the only operational stability they had. Gregory cleared his throat softly. "From a governance standpoint, this proposal aligns liability with control. It's structurally sound." My mother looked at me differently then. Not as a daughter arguing, not as an employee reacting, as someone who had understood the foundation all along. "You've been planning this," she said quietly. "I've been paying attention," I corrected. Camille looked down at the lease one more time, then back at me. "You didn't want 80%, no. Why?" "Because ownership without respect is hollow. Because I didn't want to control her the way she had tried to control me. Because what I wanted wasn't dominance, it was acknowledgement. I want balance, I said simply. The shop felt smaller in that moment, not suffocating, just intimate. The scent of lilies had faded slightly, replaced by something more neutral. Paper, ink, air. My father nodded once, slow and deliberate. We'll redraft. Gregory closed his briefcase. And just like that, the future of Rowan Petals shifted, not because I raised my voice, but because I understood the contract they never read. The power in the room didn't explode. It realigned. The amendment was never filed. Instead, Gregory drafted a new operating agreement over the next week, one that reflected what should have existed years ago. 40% to me, 40% to Camille, 20% retained by my parents. Managing member authority assigned to me for operations with defined expansion and branding authority outlined under Camille's scope. Liability aligned with equity. Personal guarantor status explicitly tied to my ownership percentage. It looked clinical on paper. Balanced. But balance doesn't feel neutral when it's earned through confrontation. The morning we signed the revised agreement, there was no ceremony. No apology speeches. Just signatures and the quiet scratch of pens across legal documents. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she initialed each page. My father read more carefully this time. Camille signed without looking at me. When it was my turn, I didn't hesitate. I signed my name, not as labor, as ownership. Life inside the shop changed in subtle ways at first. Camille still arrived later than I did, but now she asked before implementing supplier changes. She presented marketing proposals instead of announcing them. The word reporting disappeared from conversations. Instead, we used coordinate. It wasn't warm, but it was professional. My mother stopped introducing me to clients as our floral designer. She began saying, "Eliza handles operations." It wasn't poetic, but it was accurate. My father, for the first time in years, forwarded vendor emails directly to me without commentary. Respect didn't arrive as an apology. It arrived as procedural acknowledgement. Marjorie came by the shop 2 weeks later unannounced. She walked slowly through the front display, fingers brushing lightly against a row of tulips. I watched her from behind the counter. "I hear the structure's been clarified," she said softly. "It has?" I replied. She nodded once. "Good. I prefer stability." So did I. The customers never knew how close the shop had come to instability. They continued placing wedding orders, sympathy arrangements, anniversary bouquets. But I noticed something else in the weeks that followed. Camille stopped referring to the shop as my brand. She began saying our business. That shift mattered more than she realized. It wasn't perfect. We still disagreed over pricing, over aesthetic direction, over whether influencer partnerships justified the discount codes she wanted to offer. But disagreements now occurred between co-owners, not supervisor and subordinate. And something else changed too. My parents stopped speaking about succession as if it were a private decision. They involved us. Not because they suddenly understood fairness in some emotional sense, but because governance required it. There were moments late in the afternoons when the sunlight angled through the front windows and cast long reflections across the tiled floor, when I would pause and feel the difference in my chest. The shop smelled the same: eucalyptus, damp soil, faint traces of lavender from the cleaning solution. The cooler still hummed at the same uneven pitch, but I no longer felt invisible inside it. One evening, as we closed up, Camille lingered near the register. "I didn't think you cared about ownership," she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "I cared about alignment," I replied. She nodded slowly. I underestimated that. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. My father never formally said he was wrong. That wasn't his style. Instead, he began inviting me to quarterly financial reviews without prompting. My mother stopped using the phrase ownership energy. Sometimes accountability arrives not as confession, but as changed behavior. The biggest difference, though, was internal. For 15 years, I had equated sacrifice with loyalty. I believed that if I absorbed enough responsibility, quietly, recognition would follow naturally. I was wrong. Contracts define power more clearly than intentions ever will. I didn't win because I threatened. I won because I understood the structure they ignored. The shop survived, margins stabilized. Camille's marketing campaigns did bring in new subscription clients. My operational systems kept the back end steady. Together it worked. But there was no return to the version of us that existed before that morning. Trust had been replaced by clarity, and strangely, clarity felt safer. I still arrive at 4 a.m. most mornings. I still trim stems in silence while the town sleeps. The difference is this: if someone walks in and asks who owns Rowan Petals, no one looks past me anymore. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being useful, but not acknowledged. For years, I mistook usefulness for security. I believed that because I was indispensable operationally, ownership would eventually follow naturally. That if I kept showing up at 4 a.m., kept fixing what broke, kept absorbing stress quietly, the title would catch up to the labor. It doesn't work that way. Value that isn't formalized is vulnerable. I learned that the hard way. When my parents first told me they were transferring the shop to Camille, what hurt wasn't the paperwork. It was the assumption. The assumption that I would continue carrying risk without equity. That I would smile and stay grateful for proximity to something I had already built. The morning after everything was restructured, I arrived at the shop before sunrise like always. The air in Bend was cold and dry, the kind that makes your breath visible under streetlights. I unlocked the front door and stood still for a moment before turning on the lights. Nothing looked different. Same glass display case, same cooler hum, same faint scent of damp cardboard from the overnight delivery. But I felt different. For the first time, my labor and my liability were aligned. My name wasn't just on invoices and emergency contact lists, it was on ownership documents. That alignment changes how you stand in a room. It also changes how you draw boundaries. I don't hate my sister. I don't resent my parents. What I resent, what I won't allow again, is being structurally erased while being operationally relied upon. There's a difference between humility and self-erasure. I confused them for years. The truth is, families often confuse familiarity with fairness. They assume roles will remain static because they always have. The responsible one keeps being responsible. The visionary one keeps being celebrated. The quiet one keeps working. Until the quiet one reads the contract. I didn't threaten destruction because destruction would have harmed me too. I didn't storm out because walking away without leverage would have confirmed their narrative that I was emotional, not strategic. Instead, I did something simpler. I understood the structure, and I required it to reflect reality. Some nights when I close the shop and the lights click off one by one, I think about how easily this could have gone differently. If I hadn't signed the lease, if I hadn't read Section 14, if I had dismissed my father's request for the contract copy as routine. Preparation isn't paranoia, it's protection. The biggest shift wasn't in ownership percentages, it was in how I see myself. I no longer equate silence with strength. I no longer assume that loyalty guarantees respect. Respect requires definition. Boundaries require documentation, and self-worth sometimes requires ink on paper. The shop still smells like eucalyptus at dawn. The cooler still hums unevenly. Brides still cry when they see their bouquets. But when I stand behind that counter now, I'm not waiting to be recognized. I already am. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the strongest move isn't always walking away. Sometimes it's staying on your terms. If you've ever been the quiet backbone of something and felt invisible, I see you. And if this story felt real to you, if you understand what it means to align responsibility with recognition, then go ahead and subscribe. But only if you're here for honest stories about boundaries, not revenge fantasies. Tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from, and have you ever had to protect your place in something you helped build? Because sometimes the most powerful sentence in a family business isn't "I'm leaving," it's "rewrite the agreement." And next time, I'll tell you about the inheritance conversation that almost removed my name entirely.